Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first webinar for filerskeepers in 2026. People still said Happy New Year to me today, so Happy New Year, everyone, and we hope that 2026 is already an amazing year for you and will be an even better year. I must say that for us, it has been a very productive first month. Unlike last year, I don't know. Yeah, I think we have doubled the output. So it may help that our theme for this year is execute, so no excuses. Maybe we can go to the next slide, and then I will introduce the person controlling the slides today. But first, a warm welcome. Today is being recorded, by the way, just so you know, so you can also check in later and maybe share with friends. And please feel free to use the Q&A. We would love to answer your questions. We may reserve them for later. Michael, I'm not sure what your preference is, but yeah, we'll definitely come back to those.
If they're difficult, we'll leave them for later, and if they're easy, we'll answer them on the spot. Maybe.
Okay, good, brilliant. So yeah, I'm Wanne Pemelaar. I'm the CEO and co-founder for Filerskeepers and a little baby company called Lawstronaut. And we're here to talk about Filerskeepers today. What we do is we read all the laws in the world, and then we take from their rules that tell companies how long they should store their records and data. We have a platform where we can build a retention schedule for you. Only thing you have to do is tell us which industries you're in and which jurisdictions, so countries and states, and we'll build you a bespoke retention schedule that we can then keep up to date. So if the law changes, then we can send you a ping and you can say, yeah, I accept or decline the change. What happens next is something that I will talk in the next slide. But I would love to introduce to you all Michael Schweitzer. He is the president and CEO of Gravity Union, a very dear partner of ours. Michael, maybe you want to introduce yourself and Gravity Union.
Yeah, well, you stole some of my thunder, President CEO Gravity Union. Yeah, so Gravity Union, we're a Microsoft 365 implementation partner, and so we help organizations properly implement Microsoft 365 such that we get adoption and we get value out of it. And then with the idea being that the better of a job we do with the implementation of Microsoft 365, the easier it is to layer on things like compliance. And so we're really passionate about both user experience as well as records management and sensitivity privacy. And so, yeah, thanks for coming today.
Right. Well, very nice to have you, Michael. And I think this is a little slide about what it is you do.
Yeah, but we're 10 years old today. Pretty much.
Good. Congratulations. We were also born in the same month, by the way, but not as old. We're still 8 years old, so now, yeah. All right. So I already told you that on our platform you can build a retention schedule, and that retention schedule is being kept up to date. But then our clients come to us and say, what do we do now? We got something, and in the past, a retention schedule was a big one-off project, but then once you finished, it was kind of like, outdated immediately. But now that it's up to date, I can actually rely on it. So what should we do? And then we say, well, now you implement. And they go, well, where do we start? And then we can, help you with a bit of system prioritization. And when you look at it, you obviously in that list as the highest risks, you will have your ERP and your HRM systems and maybe your CRM system. But very often it's your enterprise Office suite, whether that is Microsoft or Google or Lark, I think, and that some people use in Asia. Yeah, that is probably the biggest risk. And then clients come to us and they go, how do we manage documents in Microsoft 365? How do you even implement a retention schedule in our thousands of team sites and SharePoints. The Teams was I think it started around the pandemic, and then everybody just jumped on it, but there were no well, most organizations forgot the guardrails and let the whole organization just make as many team sites as they wanted. And then should we use Purview? Not. Does it solve all your problems? We happen to have a connector with Purview, but that's just the very, very start of the whole process. Purview is definitely a useful tool, but it won't solve all your problems, because you don't only have a future-facing problem, you also have a legacy problem. And you need to fix the old stuff, and then you need to build something for the future so that you don't end up in the same situation again. I often, feel very quickly out of my depth when I talk about Microsoft. I asked Michael to help us out and to kind of give his perspective on all of this. I'm very happy to do so. And just maybe if we can go to the next slide, Michael. One of the topics that people really come to us about is email. And Michael and I already had a little discussion in the beginning before in preparation for this webinar. And is email a means of communication? Is it a record? Of course it's a record, but it also all largely depends on the content of the email. So not every single email is a record. It can also be, hey, let's grab a cup of coffee, and it has no bearing on the whole corporate housekeeping and management of documents. So, but there's lots in there that is super important. Some stuff is bet the company that will exonerate you from that, multi-million dollar suit. So but a lot of people are struggling with this, and what we see nowadays is that most folks just agree on a blanket in retention period for emails. I will say something somewhere between 6 months and 10 years. Most often it will be more like somewhere between 2 and 5 years on a retention period. That's not really a retention period. That's more like a statement to your business to say, hey, your email will disappear. So if you need to hold on to something, then please file it at an appropriate place. And that's as weak as the weakest employee. You have employees that file never, so everything will disappear after the retention period. And then you have the ones that file everything and just literally move their entire 2025 to OneDrive and say, well, I got it all figured out now, it's all safe. That's something that we see, and we see that also often companies overlook that there are actual laws that say thou shalt keep commercial correspondence X number of years. So don't forget about those. So that's where an email becomes a record, basically, in hindsight. But what is that commercial correspondence? And we see that as any email that has an impact on the rights and obligations of the company. And that you can, of course, interpret very broadly. So that can be all email, because anyone can, commit fraud and in that way bind the company. But you can also interpret that very narrowly, and that's our vision, where you say, no, this needs to, only, certain officials who are empowered by the statutes or other decisions to represent the company can bind the company, and therefore we need to keep their correspondence. So this is just something that we see companies struggle a lot about. I can talk for hours about this topic. I won't, but I'm also very interested, Michael, what your opinion is about email and what you see.
Yeah.
Do you see companies, label those things and yeah?
Yeah. So while AI, especially things like your product, are working really well, it's not quite at the point where it's going to go read all of your emails and classify things accordingly. And fundamentally, email lacks a little bit of structure to help drive, say, proper retention. And I think to your point, that while maybe lots of the email is just you and I talking about grabbing a beer next time you're in Vancouver, we also may have contracts, we may have decisions in that email. And typically what we do, and same with OneDrive, is we'll put a bit of a retention, a big bucket retention, 1 or 2 or 3 years, depending on if they're a really old organization that has like 30 years of email, you might have to do some stages and wean them off storing all their content in email. But fundamentally get them to a point where you want to motivate them to place things in a proper system of record like SharePoint, for sure. We did have one question, a specific question about some Virginia level compliance. Did you want to answer that before we move on, Vane?
Oh, yeah. That's the public is obliged by the. Oh yeah, sure, Mark. Definitely, we can do that if you like. We'll pass that on to our research teams,
Yeah.
and yeah. So the question is, can we, public sector should comply with the Virginia Public Records Act. We're very well aware of those kind of frameworks. We're working more and more for government and governmental organizations. So yeah, that's definitely an easy question. Yeah.
And maybe I'll point out your product doesn't just work directly with Purview. You can also just get a file plan, export it, and most of the tools on the market allow you to import and export via Excel and stuff like that. And we've made some connectors for some other products like Cloudware, CloudSpace, and stuff like that. So you're not just limited to Purview. Just maybe ask, like I'm conscious that I'm constantly looking at my own picture because like we all do that, but maybe you can have the AI bots in the video make it look like I'm actually paying attention to the camera. That'd be great. So the agenda for today is, we have, if you go to our YouTube channel, we have lots and lots more specifics around Purview and configuration and so on and so forth. But when we go to the ARMA conferences and the around the world, probably if an organization is struggling to implement records management in Microsoft 365, it's going to be probably because one of these 7, or probably a mixture of these 7 issues or items and stuff like that. So these are probably like our seven kind of top line best practices. They're not all kind of hardcore, how do I configure a specific record category in Purview, but there may be some change management and some politics and people involved. And so we'll kind of go through these topics. The compliance for detail and design, getting over the fear of detail, taking an enterprise approach configuration, aligning retention and how people work, keeping the process lean and mean, rolling out strategically, and fixing control of fixing out of control M365 implementations. So compliance and the need for detail. So while yes, we do have some AI capabilities that's growing around classification, fundamentally, records management in Microsoft 365 is a mapping exercise. So I go off into SharePoint or a Teams instance, and I create a solution around contracts or policies or procedures. And oftentimes in larger enterprise organizations, we'll have multiple copies of that solution throughout the enterprise. And really what we want to do is identify that content and map that back to a record category or a retention label or a record series, whatever you want to call it that week. That will apply the life cycle to that content. So whether it's like 7 years in place or active, semi-active, so on and so forth. And so fundamentally, big picture, it's quite difficult to apply records management to a big, messy implementation of SharePoint. And we have a little snapshot of a survey I saw on LinkedIn, which is that, 80% of organizations out there probably have a messy SharePoint implementation to some degree, and they're all over the map. Our clients don't, but yeah, by and large, most organizations turned it on during the pandemic. They're a bit of a rush. We have a million teams, and I've got a contracts in 1,000 different locations. So fundamentally, the biggest takeaway is that like detail and design of your Microsoft 365 implementation is really the path to compliance. We say the path to compliance is through collaboration even. And so often our focus is, well, what's the best possible user experience in SharePoint in terms of searching, sorting, filtering, and managing my contracts. The additional benefits of good detail and design are we get increased user adoption of the system. Usually when we have a messy SharePoint implementation with a lack of metadata and we have folders and so on and so forth, usually it's difficult to find that stuff, which can frustrate people. And when you think about it, if you've ever looked and peeled the onion layers back, and most of the RMs in the marketplace, including Purview, those will often use search to find that content. So if you as an end user can't find that content through search, it will also be difficult to have Purview find that content and therefore classify that content using search as well. But fundamentally, anything that you want to do that adds value to Microsoft 365 will be easier and more effective and cheaper if we have a really well-structured SharePoint design. And whether that's I want to integrate a line of business system with SharePoint, whether we want to do workflows or integrations, or layer on privacy or sensitivity and so on and so forth. It's not impossible to do those things without a well-designed SharePoint or Microsoft 365 implementation, but it's way easier and more effective and more accurate, and you will achieve a higher level of compliance if we have a great design. We want to look at what doesn't thoughtful, detailed design look like. So if some of these things resonate with you and you see in your organizations, one of the most common, I'll use sarcastic air quotes, migration projects is called lift and shift, where some executive somewhere says, hey, we want to move from the K drive into SharePoint, and I want this done in the next month. And they just take all this content and throw it into a handful of sites and so on and so forth. We call it lifting and shifting or dumping into SharePoint. So if you've seen that, probably an issue. If you go into your sites and you only have the out-of-the-box documents library with a bunch of folders and subfolders, contract v1, contract v2, final underscore final, Bonnie's copy, Michael's copy, so on and so forth. That's probably an indication that we don't have enough thoughtful detailed design. So lots of folders, one document library per. We have lots of user frustration. You might have lower adoption. Like typically when your Microsoft 365 implementation isn't well honed and it's not a great user experience, people have a tendency to keep things in their email or use OneDrive and create a solution around that. And ultimately, we're probably incurring social risk that we don't want to incur. Or you'll see the higher adoption of competing solutions. And I've actually seen this multiple times now where a large enterprise organization turns on Microsoft 365, they dump a bunch of stuff in there, they don't do any design, then they say, hey, this platform isn't very good, it sucks, let's go somewhere else. And they repeat the same mistake moving into a different competing platform, and ultimately they're not solving the problem because they didn't understand what the fundamental issue was to begin with. And big picture, like how do you, I mean, when you see a SharePoint site that's nothing but folders and there's no metadata and there's no design, there's no consistency, it's trying to, how would we classify this pile of messy papers off? That's like having that messy SharePoint site is very much like having a pile of papers and who knows what's there. And there could be a whole bunch of risk buried in that pile of papers. What does it look like? Typically well organized. So if you're sort of newish to SharePoint, we call the content type gallery, which is where a central location where we configure all of our content types. We can reuse that stuff over time. It's well organized, and it's a great user experience for everyone. Typically, each document library is going to map to one record category. That's a good sort of wet finger in the air of, are we headed into the right design of the solution? So just a little before and after there, but just an example of like we have a single purpose document library here for some policies, and we have a handful of metadata there, but it's nice and well organized, and every document library serves a single purpose. Or here we have some employee files. We have a handful of things for some document sets. So this is an example of some good design. I can search, sort, and filter. And if we have this level of design in our SharePoint environment, then it's going to be quite easy for us to layer on the records management bit. So that is number one takeaway is you have to roll up your sleeves, give it the Marie Kondo design for SharePoint, and the more design, the better. So interestingly, great segue into our next talking point. For those of you who have been in IT or are IT adjacent, and records management often is, we, the past 10, 20, 30, 40 years of doing IT projects, one of the biggest lessons learned that we have from IT projects is that detail equals pain. So when we're developing our systems, the more data, the more drop-down lists, the more what we call cyclomatic complexity, the more if and then and else statements and so on and so forth that we build into our system, the more issues we have, the more bugs we have, the more testing is required, the more complex our upgrades and updates are, so on and so forth. And so, rightfully so, many people that work on IT projects have learned to steer away from detail because that actually reduces our risk for the project. And perhaps we would be more happy having a less functionality but more successful project because it was on time and within scope and so on and so forth. The speaker's audio is cutting out, hard to understand what he's talking about. Well, sorry about that. I will try to improve that.
It's just sometimes, Michael.
Okay,
But maybe I'll let you know, and then I'll
sure.
have you repeat yourself when it happens. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, I've moved the mic a little bit forward, so hopefully that helps. So yeah, we do have this sort of fear of detail within IT projects in general. But SharePoint has really come a long way in its maturity as a platform. And it's actually detail in those solutions that actually adds sustainability and so on and so forth. And it's when we do proper design, we actually get more value, get more stability. And so it's when we have this fear of detail or this fear of design in our IT projects, and we just give people an out-of-the-box SharePoint site with one document library, and then they create a bunch of folders and subfolders and so on and so forth, and create a bit of a mess of it, that will actually incur more maintenance downstream, and it causes more issues. And our libraries, they grow, they're large, they're hard to use, they're hard to navigate, and when we want to do things like target a workflow against a document library, that becomes very difficult. Really, we're actually hedging risk when we add more detail to Microsoft 365. And it's when we don't design for scalability and security and compliance that we're into issues in maintenance. And so this is kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people, especially that have experience in IT projects. And in many of our projects, once we've done the final design, we've migrated in there, there's little to no maintenance at all, except for adding the cool stuff, adding records management, doing the classification, adding a chat bot, leveraging AI, so on and so forth. And it's a little screenshot from a LinkedIn survey that I saw, which is like, yeah, probably 70% of organizations have made this mistake. They don't quite have that detail and design. They were fearful of it. And now they're kind of struggling to get value out of it. And then they know that they need to redesign it or they actually have plans to redesign it. So it's nice not to be in that situation. This can be a bit of a tricky, a question about the trainable classifiers. Yeah, they're not bad. They're okay. There are a bunch of other benefits with getting a proper design in there. They can help to a degree. You will get some false positives. There's some out of the box ones that do an okay job, but they're not perfect. And if you have a document library where we're storing all of our contracts for a specific scenario, it's easier, faster, and probably better just to use a regular classification to map to that document library. The other thing too is if we have just imagine like the nightmare scenario is I've got a million Teams instances and I've got contracts in all those teams. It can take quite a while for those systems to find that content. But we also have a security issue as well, right? So we don't know if that content's in the right location and do we have the proper security applied to it? So that can be a bit of an issue. And then as well, when we think about artificial intelligence and leveraging AI, there's a couple different design patterns there, but one of them is going to be, hey, I want to leverage our enterprise content and wrap up what we call the RAG and send to the LLM through Copilot and get some value out of it. If I don't have a central location of all the current the current and up-to-date content for a specific scenario, it's going to be more difficult for Copilot or whatever tool to actually do some of that AI content generation. So there's a bunch of other benefits as well from not doing that. So the notion of, hey, we're just going to let SharePoint go crazy, have duplicates and copies everywhere, and make a mess of it, and hopefully the AI gods will help sort us out later. We're not quite there as a reality yet. It may be in the future. Right now it's a little bit expensive. It's not perfect. Tends to misclassify stuff once in a while. Versus if we had say a more structured SharePoint approach, we'll have a higher degree of compliance. It'll be easier to apply that.
So about the classifiers, the training classifiers, is that something that Purview provides then out of the box? Because what I also notice very often is that, Microsoft is a great tool. I'm a big fan, and but it's also very generic, in terms and
Yeah.
it doesn't truly know your business in all its complexity. And so
yeah, there's Purview does provide this. There's some out of the box ones. They tend to have some false positives and what have you. So they're not perfect. You can create your own where you need to upload a couple hundred examples of a certain type of document and train it. But you're looking at taking a week or two to try and train it and get up to speed. So certainly should be part of your strategy for sure. But I don't think it's the be-all end-all, and the overall approach. You're probably still better off right now to do classification, where we're matching on content types or locations within SharePoint. There's a question about your product, Vani, there.
now I think we'll take that at the end, but I don't want to interrupt your flow too much. But I'll
Okay.
definitely circle back on that one. Yeah.
So, yeah, this can be, if you have a messy implementation, sometimes executives don't quite have the buy-in. Sometimes they're, you may need to, influence across organization or down. So this can actually take a little bit of work. But what we've seen work the best is if you're struggling to get executive buy-in and support on this, go find some allies in the organization, if it's legal or IT, whoever that appreciate the complexities, the need for compliance. That's one thing. If you're able to do a bit of a skunkworks project, so go in and pick an important part of the business that's keen and eager and willing to work with you and create a cool solution within Microsoft 365 that has workflows and reports and some cool stuff and records management, and then maybe you add on some AI. Then you go team and it's really environment. They'll have an aha moment and be more willing to loosen up the purse strings and support that organization implementation.
Michael, you broke up now, so maybe the last part if you could repeat. By the way, I would whisper HR or legal. Anyhow, that's a good first step. It's not controversial, but please you could repeat that last part.
The last bit being that, it's one of the most successful strategies that we've seen is doing a bit of a skunkworks project where we find some willing departments to maybe double down on, do an extra fancy SharePoint site with some records management and some AI and some workflows, and then take that to the powers that be and perhaps show them the old messy site and the new one and show them the potential. Oftentimes, executives don't quite get it, and they'll ask you to, well, go do the implementation for human resources and then give that solution to procurement. Well, no, it's the level of detail that we're working at is the employee ID and the employment type, and procurement doesn't have that, right? So it doesn't quite work that way. An enterprise approach to configuration. So really we want to centralize our configuration within Microsoft 365. If you're familiar with SharePoint, I can go to a library and I can add a drop-down list of departments. If I do that, that is the only location where that drop-down list of departments is. And if you empower the business too much to do their own configuration and their own design, what ends up happening is you wake up a couple years down the road and you'll have 1,000 different drop-down lists of departments. And if you're trying to do discovery or your maintenance, and now you've got 10 different spellings of HR, that can be a bit of a nightmare. It's harder to glean value out of the platform. So one of our must-haves in our projects is we always centralize our configuration, use the content type hub, centrally manage it, and do all configuration there. But what we'll end up seeing is when we have this decentralized configuration, take policies, for example, we may have 5 different copies of the solution throughout the organization. And when we go to layer on purview or records management, each of these may require their own configuration. So it's nice if we only have one copy of that solution. So just an example we may have, like this could be a possible solution for policies and procedures, where we have guidelines and standards under folders, or maybe we have a more sophisticated solution where it's one document library per type of document, so on and so forth, which is what we want to lean towards. And then we have something nice like this. Not sure why we missed that little S's there, but yeah, essentially we want to have that deploy that same solution to multiple locations. And that's both on a, say, content type basis, if you're familiar with content types, as well as like columns as well. It's nice to have that one solution that we deploy everywhere there. And if you haven't seen the content type gallery, it's a central location in SharePoint where we go and do our configuration. And I can then, on each content type, I have a little publish button that allows me to copy that everywhere. So that every department across the organization, or even multiple geos, can use that fundamentally the same underlying solution. And then we think about, when we do our purview configuration, for example, since we have the same solution everywhere, it becomes quite easy. I can do a rule like this to apply the label and say, hey, where my content type equals policy. And now this will go to 100 different locations to classify this content, versus if we had 100 different types of policy solutions, I would have to add a bunch of ands, and I would run out of space in my KQL query. Again, the idea is we have all these policies everywhere, and we're just trying to map that and manage the content across the enterprise. And again, so yeah, there's a question about configuration of division departments. Says I'll answer this question. When doing enterprise level content types or configurations, can individual divisions or departments filter out the parts that don't apply to them? Yeah, there's a strategy around this. So we can have a hierarchy and have an inheritance schema for content types. So you could create a generic contract content type, for example. And then I may make a more specific contract for HR that just lists the HR vendors. And I can also inherit from that enterprise contract content type and apply just the IT vendors for the IT department. And then when I'm actually matching on the content type, I can actually match on a portion of the content type ID and go down that path. So it is totally possible. It takes a little bit of thoughtfulness and planning around your content type creation, but it'll certainly pay dividends. And it's just, you want to start nice and high, start with this optimal solution. People will add some local columns once in a while, but we want to try and avoid it as much as possible to get the most value out of the platform. But there are other values again. So other benefits from centralizing our configuration in Microsoft 365. We'll get cost savings. It'll be easy to search, sort, filter, and find. So e-discovery becomes easier. You know, if we don't do design and we don't have our centralized configuration, I may have a folder that represents a company name, or I may have various spellings of a company name. And if I'm trying to do e-discovery or search, now that's more of a complex issue for me to manage the content. So there's lots of benefit that come with that, even if you end up using the trainable classifiers and Purview or similar functionality in some of the third-party add-ons. Number 4 is to align retention of how people work. So many of you are probably aware that back in the day when we all walked uphill both ways to work in the snow, and most records management systems required us to perhaps collaborate outside of the system, emailing documents back and forth, storing things on my desktop. And then once it became a finalized record, we would store it in the system of record. And that last mile was often annoying and difficult, and people just didn't do it. And so we would spend big dollars for these big records management platforms that had every bell and whistle from a compliance standpoint, but ultimately they suffered from adoption. And Microsoft's strategy was really to, hey, let's build out a platform that really supports how people work. Let's allow them to collaborate. My theory is they had a bit of a strategy that, hey, it's more important to get content to the system, because if I'm a chief information officer or a chief technology officer and I'm looking at my budgets for the next year, and I have some organizations have 10 different ECM platforms, I'm ultimately going to make a decision on which ones I keep paying for by how many documents are actually going into those systems, not just the functionality of those systems. So really what we do is when we have our retention and we're configuring Purview, we really want to try and align that configuration to how people work. Really what you want to do is build out a business solution that allows people to collaborate naturally and organically, and with a great user experience. And if we do that, there's always enough detail to layer on records management automatically behind the scenes. How important are naming conventions to individual files? Not very important anymore. Oftentimes, the naming conventions include a vendor name and a date, and it can be quite frustrating for people to have to type out the vendor name as part of the file name, and then select it in the drop-down list, or we'll have to configure the AI to automatically set the metadata. So naming conventions are important when that content is going to leave your organization and the person receiving that file needs some of the context of that file. So if it's a contract V2 or with the red line from our legal counsel or something like that, you may put that in there. By and large, we typically design the solution such that you don't need a naming convention. And if you find that you need one, that could be, not always, but it could be a cue that you need to take a step back, and we may need to add a layer to the design of the solution. But yeah, I'd say by and large, we have large enterprise implementations of Microsoft 365, and there is nary a naming convention available or required for that. Sometimes, maybe take that back. Sometimes we have naming conventions, say for document sets or for sites. And in those cases, we'll often automate that process. So you'll throw up a Power App that collects some information like the project name and the date, and it'll automatically provision that project site along with the metadata. And the retention schedule structure be modified to accommodate additional classification information for the record series, like security categorization, or whether content in a category qualifies for transfer for long-term archivals or functions. So yeah, kind of depending on which tool you end up going with, oftentimes your record series or your record label or retention schedule will define the life cycle of that content, the semi-active, the active stage, what happens at the end, is it transfer, is it declare, is it destroy, so on and so forth. And there's some options there as well, and certainly with filerskeepers, crypto, but they're free to add additional record categories all they want if they need to do that as well.
Yep.
Okay.
And I'm still going to answer those questions at the end, guys. It's not that I want to answer them, but I really am enjoying Michael's flow, so I don't want to interrupt it too much. But I promise you, I will answer questions still. Yeah.
So some other food for thought. So 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was all the rage to declare a record in SharePoint. And this kind of brought up the question, well, what is a record? And if we were having drinks at a records management party, some people would say, well, everything in SharePoint is technically a record because it's probably part of the business process. Who knows? There might be some embarrassing photos from your Halloween party that probably aren't, but it's a good debate to have. And so when we declare a record in SharePoint, although that in-place records management feature is being turned off if you're following the roadmap in April, so you need to figure out what's going to happen there. It would put this little golden lock on the record, and it would prevent deletion, and it would prevent editing of that content. And you had an in-between state where you could prevent deletion but allow editing, which is kind of cool in some cases if I wanted to, say, have a supersede obsolete setup and make it really easy. That being said, if you do decide that there's some areas within SharePoint that warrant to have a declared record, or if you've turned on, there's a hidden feature that's not turned on by default called regulatory record. And I know your question is going to be, aren't all records regulatory records? Yes, but in the world of Purview, there's an additional feature that makes it impossible to like undeclare and delete that content after the fact. If we declare too early, we will motivate people to not use the solution. Because I've had some records managers that wanted to, as soon as it's in SharePoint, it's our system of record, we're going to lock it down. But really what you're doing is you're forcing people to collaborate outside of the platform. And now we have multiple copies in our email back and forth through our desktop or OneDrive and so on and so forth. So there's a balance there. It's balancing the needs for collaboration and compliance.
It's also
And then,
the reason why we, in our connector, we need to set some default settings. Otherwise, the Graph API that connects to Purview won't accept the retention period. And we've chosen as a default not to make it a regulatory record, not to lock it down, not to, and also not to do auto deletion, by the way, but always have a review. But
yeah.
Anyhow.
And there was when declaring records, I would say as an industry, we learned that declaring records also incurred a bit of a maintenance task. So once it's locked down and declared, and then we go through a reorg, and let's just say I have all of my contracts in the organization in one document library, and I've tagged them with each department. I've got HR, IT, and legal, and we decide that, hey, we want to split these contracts up, and like the one question or comment about having specific metadata for specific departments, awesome idea, probably a good idea. To move those documents around and undeclare them became a bit of a task. So most tools on the market now, both Purview and the third-party ecosystem of records management solutions in the marketplace, allow you to do basically automatically take a copy of that document if someone touches it. So once we've layered on some retention to the document, classified it, it doesn't have to be locked down. We can still allow editing for that content, and then in the case of Purview, depending on how we have it configured, it can go to what's called the preservation hold library, and it's automatically going to take a copy of that document and place it there. You need to balance that with your tenant storage usage, because that will go towards your storage of your tenant. So it's a bit of a balance of, hey, maybe we don't quite classify it. We know that we're looking at some of the cool new features within Microsoft 365 and SharePoint to do some of the smart versioning. So don't always store all 500 versions, but we can say for the first 30 days, when most versions are created, we give you 500 versions, and then SharePoint will automatically delete the historical ones and do like weekly and monthly backups. And so we know that in most cases, most versions are created within the first month or two, so you may balance that and maybe not classify until the document's a month or two old. It's hopefully most of the versions have been settled, and you'll balance some of the tenant storage usage, so on and so forth. And so many of you have probably seen a file plan before that has an active stage and it has a semi-active stage. And what may be missing from your file plan is the collaboration stage. For how long do people get to work on this content before we, if need to, declare it or preserve it or do the classification of that content? And that could be driven by multiple factors. If it's a policy, we may have a draft policy area, and once we approve it, then we make a copy of a PDF with different library, and that could be the trigger, so on and so forth. Maybe one comment here. So Vanya, we're having a discussion yesterday about how big should your file plan be. And I'll go off a bit of a tangent on this. It used to be when we first rolled out records management systems, a lot of them looked like a filing cabinet with folders and so on and so forth. And there was this analogy to how we dealt with paper records in the real world. And when we first implemented records management systems, back in the 80s, we just brought that retention schedule forward. And oftentimes we had thousands of record categories because we had these repeating topics over multiple departments and so on and so forth. And in those older systems where when we required people to manually classify stuff, they would often get it wrong, as much as 95% of the time. Ask me how I know. I've seen it. And so we thought, hey, as a community of compliance people, we'll say, hey, let's increase the size of the dartboard. Is that right? And let's have less buckets to throw stuff into. So we created functional file plans, and we were hoping that people would, having less buckets to throw stuff into, that they would have an easier time classifying content. And they still weren't very good at it. So though, let's just do a big bucket. Let's just screw it. Let's just do 25 record categories, and let's just if it's finance, the longest one wins. We'll just do one record category for all of finance or whatever happens to be. What you'll find in practice is going too big bucket, get down to 1 or 2 dozen record categories, is probably not effective in Purview. You have you have to target your record categories to a specific location. There is a dynamic ruling of record categories you can do. It's get more complex there, but by and large, when you publish out a record category for use in Microsoft 365, if I'm in the IT department and I am manually classifying, seldom the case, I don't want to have to sift through the HR record categories. So what we've kind of landed on is probably that functional 200 to 300 record categories is probably a healthy budget. And then maybe per jurisdiction, or you may have some augmented things or per jurisdiction if you're multi-jurisdictional. But that's the nice thing. And one big, huge deciding or driving factor for that is your record category should determine who's responsible for disposition. Unless you're going to do what Vonnie said not to do, which is just do auto deletion, because that's be really scary. Yeah, some food for thought there. So it's nice, big picture. We take into account that collaboration stage. We let people work on that content before we put our hands on it. We then do some declaration or preservation by making copies of it. We want to balance storing too many copies of those versions. We then have the active stage where the record is like a current record and people are going to reference it, so on and so forth, and that should stay in place. And then we have the semi-active stage, and what might drive it to a semi-active stage could be multiple factors. It could be that it's just content that no one's going to look at. If it's an invoice in the old paper world, behind me I would have current year's invoices and last year's invoices, but 2 years ago I probably wouldn't need them. Put those into a box and put them down below. So there is value to be had in Microsoft 365 of sending things off. You can use Microsoft 365 Archive. There's the tools out there that you can layer onto the platform to also just take that content out of SharePoint and just leave the current valid corpus of information so that people can make sure that they're basing their decisions off of the right and current information. And then we have whatever disposition, transfer, delete, so on and so forth. But again, you may have to rethink. If you have this file plan that was created in 1975, that's paper-based, there may need to be this translation of, well, how do I actually apply this into a real-world setting, regardless if it's Purview or something else.
By the way,
Okay.
we're in our last 15 minutes, Michael, just sharing.
12 minutes. So
yeah.
Keeping the process, maybe I'll skip over some of the slides here, then the effort time to save some time for questions, but I'm keeping the process lean and agile. So we got lots of time here. We'll go into this. When we think about software development risks, so going back to the 90s and 2000s, you've probably all seen those news articles of the government project that was supposed to be $1 million that ended up being $100 million and what went wrong. And so developing software was really, really, really risky back in the day. High salaries, take time, getting those requirements dialed in, so on and so forth. And so how we manage that software development risk was we would have lots of documentation, we would have all these processes, we'd have tighter controls and plans and multiple environments. We'd have all this sign off from the business to make sure that we were giving them what they wanted, so on and so forth. And then looking at sort of this historical approach to managing projects in SharePoint. So in 2007, 2010, so on and so forth. And we had, on top of the software development risks, oftentimes you didn't get as much out of the box in SharePoint on premises as you do now in SharePoint Online and Microsoft 365. And so we had a lot of the risks that we have with SharePoint, our software development, but we also have these interdependencies. So, well, what version of SQL do I have? And if I have a third-party tool installed, is that installing a DLL? that is going to overwrite an older version of the DLL that SharePoint needs, and all these issues that could come up. And it could be very well be that your IT department, with the very best of intentions, upgraded SQL Server to the latest version, but it may be that the patch or the version of SharePoint you were on actually didn't work with that version of SQL Server. And so there's lots of complexity there. We had scale and performance issues, databases with network issues, search indexes. We had to manage upgrades and patches and customizations, and we had to like browser support. So if I'm developing a web page, I have to test it, make sure it works in Firefox and Mozilla, so on and so forth. So there's lots of complexity. And so, as a result, a lot of the things that we did with software development, we applied to large enterprise SharePoint projects. SharePoint Online is really a different beast. We don't have to worry about the version of SQL Server. It's in the cloud. They scale automatically for us. We may have some customizations, but by and large, we have done a large, massive 5,000-10,000 person organizations, and didn't have to do a single bit of customization in the system. And then when there is some customization, it's just going to be a workflow. The workflows have actually a test and non-production environment built into them in Power Automate and Power Apps and so on and so forth. So a lot of those risks that we had, and a lot of the, I'll call it, industry memory and knowledge around how we hedge risks in SharePoint projects isn't necessarily valid anymore. And so the reality is that SharePoint Online is a much, much less risky environment to move into. And so we will often see organizations leveraging, I'll call them old school IT risk management approaches to their SharePoint environment. And it's actually not paying dividends. I have seen enterprise it's box configuration, but they bring a team of 10 develop people that are testing out of the box functionality, and there's no value to be had there. And I have seen projects be bloated with all kinds of requirements, analysis, design. They had multiple environments. They're pushing the content through, and arguably 90% of the effort of that project was to the red tape and bureaucracy of that project, and there was no value to be had because there's so little risk in SharePoint Online. Many enterprise organizations, you may have a small dev or test environment for integrations or some workflows, or you want to play with some stuff, fair. But the notion of having a test or dev environment and having to push our configuration through multiple environments, typically, in most cases, is not paying dividends. And just to really, really boil it down for you, like, I can now go into SharePoint Online and create, well, if I know what to know what I'm building, so you do some requirements and you do whatever, but I can go in and I can configure a content type in a library, even maybe a workflow in 5 or 10 or 15 minutes. But if I had to configure that in a test environment and then wait for someone from IT to push that configuration to production without wrecking what's currently there, that could turn it from a 10-minute task into an 8-hour task, or even, and maybe that's just the effort, but then now it's the duration is a week because someone's on vacation. So really keeping your project lean and agile can pay dividends and will allow you to shift a lot of that effort to higher value activities and creating that detailed design that we talked about. That's so important. Yeah, so go to change. I'll maybe skip over some of these things, leave some time for questions here. I will, from a lean perspective, actually, so if you know, like the lean philosophies and lean manufacturing, one key takeaway is the need to have this official approval from the business before you move on to the next step can be a huge wet blanket for your project. If you're following best practices of the Microsoft 365, odds are it's going to be quite easy for you to make those changes in the future. And so if you tell the business, hey, legal department, I need your final sign off and there's no more changes after this, odds are they're going to take weeks to approve that. But if you're like, hey, legal, are we headed in the right direction? Is this kind of close to what you're looking for? Maybe make a commitment or promise that if they want changes made to it, we'll go ahead and commit to making those changes without worrying about it. And the reality is, if you follow a very agile approach where you're prototyping and you're showing it to people and you're getting feedback, and you have this iterative cycle where you're constantly being course corrected to the perfect solution for that business unit, the odds of you missing the mark are quite low. I don't think we've ever had a department that where we went live and they're like, you know what, this doesn't work for us, because they've been there through the entire journey. And maybe their change management thing, bring the entire department along for that journey. Like, don't take Bob from accounting and have him do the project and have the other 19 people from accounting in the dark and then surprise them with a system. Have the entire group there part of that journey, because really every touch point of the process is going to be teaching them about the process. All right, we'll go super quick here. Rolling out empathetically. Big picture, you can do requirements analysis and design for a department in 3 to 4 weeks from, let's say, a project team effort. However, that being said, you probably don't want the business to move that fast. They're going to need time to sleep on decisions and so on and so forth. So what we do is we'll take probably 12 to 13 weeks to do that roll-up process, where you're only going to hit them up once or twice a week for an hour at a time, so they can still get their day job done to move forward. So do not try to rush them. The more you rush them, the more resistance you get. If we take a slower approach, let them sleep on decisions, let them acclimatize to the new way of working, just training, you'll get more excitement and more engagement with them, because they don't feel stress, they don't feel pressure. And the more engagement we get, the better of a solution that we end up creating with them, and the more higher degree of compliance that we'll actually obtain by getting the engagement from the business to create the really cool solution within Microsoft 365. Just some slides here on the typical effort, so on and so forth. And then typically an organization might look like something like this, where we're rolling out multiple groups or departments at a time. So just really taking your time and moving things forward. You don't want to do the big bang approach. And then, yeah, a very common solution is fixing out of control Microsoft 365 environments or implementations. So we have a huge enterprise implementation of Microsoft 365. We're not using the content type hub. We have 100,000 team sites, so on and so forth. How do we wrangle this in? Really, there's no magic bullet. It may take a long time, but big picture, what we typically want to do is we want to go through and clean up the implementation the best we can. So empty sites, unused sites, the stuff we can get rid of, let's get rid of it. Moving some of that stuff to M365 archive and get it out of the way would be a good approach. We want to clean up the rot, like Bonnie said before, probably apply some of the big picture retention to Exchange and OneDrive and so on and so forth. We want to stop the bleeding, move things forward. Here's an example of roadmap where we'll probably do some storage and cleanup. We'll do some big picture lifecycle management for content. Maybe layer on some automated classification to look for the really, really important contracts or documents, exactly data matches or AI. You'll then want to go through probably some site or library level classification within the system to put some kind of life cycle on it, but you may identify some sites that really deserve to have a complete redesign, and then big picture get some fundamental governance in place. So, yeah.
So, I think I'm going to skip also a few slides. Maybe we can go back one slide. And Michael, I think, and I really enjoyed this because I think it's really cool to learn that, first of all, 12 to 13 weeks, to make some real impact into your Microsoft 365. It sounds very reasonable, to be honest. So of course, if it's a messy implementation, you'll have more hurdles to clear. But very often this sounds so daunting to companies, like, oh, I don't want to even start with this, and they're putting it off. And the fact that it's not that manual that people think is also important. There's definitely still manual stuff in there, but the systems are becoming smarter, and you can, work smart, not hard, on this. And I think we all have that. The biggest issue that we all have with Microsoft, I think, is that we are also all pretty much stuck in the past and really familiar with the old school functionality that it had, and it's hard to keep up when it comes to these big vendors, and what's new. And so I think it's very doable, and I think we ought to really seriously look into implementing in Microsoft. I also see a lot of a tendency now to go to structured systems, to move things out of Microsoft. I'm not sure if you see that too, but maybe if you just structure it better, you don't have to you don't have to spend the extra money on additional systems. Yeah. Maybe just because I promised Dale that I would answer his questions, and we have 1 minute left. So if you don't mind, yes, of course, a retention schedule that you build on filerskeepers can be modified to accommodate additional classification. Like, we see, does this contain personal data? Yes, no. What's the security categorization? What's, does this need to go to archive? What's what happens at the end, of the retention period? Definitely possible. It's very flexible. We allow you to set any extra metadata, and you can even in our software talk about your retention schedules, and have comments and work a little bit like Microsoft 365. We can have an audit trail of changes over time, whether it is the changes that you accept in the schedule or any action that you perform within the schedule. It all gets logged. We keep everything up to date. We promise every 6 months, but we do way more often. So and that's also because we have the benefit of our sister company called Lawstronaut that crawls government portals and checks for laws that get updated and everything. But it kind of depends also on the subscription and sorry, on the jurisdiction. Some countries are teeny tiny islands in the Pacific that just don't ship that much laws during the year, so we don't have to check that often. So that's it. There are more questions. Yes, you can get a copy of this presentation, and we'll send it around. And we'll be doing more webinars. We'll do more by ourselves, where we talk about how to implement retention, how to build retention schedules, and we do with very awesome partners that we like Gravity Union. So thank you very much, Michael. We have the QR codes and email addresses here. So if you want to reach out to us, please feel free, and maybe reference this webinar. Thank you.
Maybe one quick question we can answer: the defining collaboration stage limiting event triggers. No, those can be coupled. They can't be, but it's not going to limit the need for an event. Necessarily, well, it depends what you mean by an event, but like a case category, like project end date or employment termination, you still might need those for that, but they may drive the different stages. So sorry. All right, cool.
No, it's fine. And guys, I can imagine that this webinar only triggers more questions. So please feel, reach out to Gravity Union and hop on a call with them. In the worst case, you get a half an hour of free advice, right? I'm sorry, Michael. But I think it's just worthwhile. Don't put it off. For us, the theme this year is execute. So let's just do it.
I love talking about it. So I'm happy to have chats.
All right. Brilliant. Thanks, guys. Have a wonderful day. Okay. Thank you for joining.